Sorry, wrong number. Guided close read. For those of you unfamiliar with mid-20th century communication, telephone numbers were literally dialed, as in the rotary phone shown on page 111. There was no voice messaging. If a phone was in use, a caller heard a short series of beeps called a busy signal. Each phone number began with a two-letter abbreviation. For example, the phone exchange Murray Hill in this play was MU. Callers dialed the number for information to talk to a live operator who looked up phone numbers. A play or drama is a form of literature meant to be performed by actors in front of an audience. The script for a play begins with a list of all the characters in the play, called the cast of characters. In this play, the main character is Mrs. Stevenson, and the other characters have supporting roles. Look at the cast of characters on page 111. What can you predict about the action of the play based on the operator and information listings? Pause while you think. Mrs. Stevenson will talk to 7 different telephone operators over the course of the action. Typography conventions are used to support people reading a script. Italic type, often in parentheses, denotes stage directions. These are unspoken instructions about how the drama should be performed. The letters L and R denote stage left and stage right when facing the audience. Roman type labels the characters' names within the stage directions. Roman type is also used for the dialogue, the words spoken by the characters. The character's name in boldface type precedes his or her lines of dialogue. Reread lines 1 through 15 and 28 and 29. Find the descriptive details in the stage directions that tell what is lit and what is in darkness on stage. Pause while you think. Mrs. Stevenson in her bed in the center of the stage is lit by a table lamp. The left and right sections of the stage are dark. In lines 28 and 29, what ideas do you have about Mrs. Stevenson's character based on the description? Pause while you think. The script describes her as querulous, self-centered, neurotic. That means she's nervous, demanding, and possibly not likable. Like other forms of literature, this play has a series of events called a plot. The first part of the plot, called the exposition, gives the audience the basic information about the conflict, which is the struggle between opposing forces that will drive the rest of the plot. Reread lines 80 through 96. What do the audience and Mrs. Stevenson learn at the same time? Pause while you think. A murder of a woman is being planned by 2 men, one working for a client and the other named George, the hired killer. The lighting and dialogue help audiences understand that different characters on stage are each in a different setting, the time and place of the events. Reread lines 110 through 125. Find the details that describe what the audience sees on stage. Pause while you think. Spotlights go off the 2 men. Then one spotlight lights the first operator's switchboard. Mrs. Stevenson, still in bed, is no longer overhearing the men's phone conversation, but is speaking to the operator. Stage directions help actors know what emotions to convey and help readers visualize those emotions. Reread lines 176 through 182. Find the stage directions that reveal how Mrs. Stevenson feels. Why might she feel that way? Pause while you think. As she wipes her forehead with the handkerchief, she's glancing uneasily for a moment toward the window. That uneasy glance reveals that she is worried about what might be happening outside. The conflict in a drama or other fictional work is the problem that the characters try to resolve. Efforts to resolve the conflict create the action of the plot and build suspense, the feeling of growing tension and excitement felt by readers and viewers of a play. Reread lines 194 through 200. What is Mrs. Stevenson's conflict, and how does she attempt to resolve it? Pause while you think. The conflict is set up when Mrs. Stevenson overhears plans for a murder. She is desperate for the operator to trace the call and find the men so they can be apprehended. Once the conflict sets the plot in motion, the events that occur are called the rising action. Reread lines 235 through 266. Give ideas about why rising action is a fitting term to describe what is happening. Pause while you think. As Mrs. Stevenson tries to explain what she wants to the chief operator, her panic starts to rise. The suspense builds for the audience too because it's clear that the call can't be traced and precious time is passing. Stage directions help readers visualize how characters are entering and exiting the scene. Reread lines 238 through 304. What does the audience see as Mrs. Stevenson dials the phone? Pause while you think. The table to the right that was hidden in darkness is now lit with a spotlight. A new character, second operator, is seated at it. Suspense is building as Mrs. Stevenson keeps trying to persuade others that a murder is going to occur. Reread lines 337 through 349. Identify words that show Duffy's reaction to Mrs. Stevenson's call. What effect does the writer want to create? Duffy relaxes, sighs, starts taking lunch from a bag. He says, "Yes, ma'am," in a voice that shows he's not impressed. The effect is to build tension because the audience knows that Mrs. Stevenson is right, but she can't seem to explain the situation convincingly. A dramatist uses dialogue to move the action along and to provide information to the audience. Reread lines 384 through 405. What is Mrs. Stevenson revealing to the audience as she speaks to Duffy? Pause while you think. She herself lives in a place like the one described by the murder planners. She is all alone because her husband is not home and it's the maid's night off. The woman who is to be murdered is also alone in her house. In line 401, Mrs. Stevenson describes herself as an invalid. We can use context to determine the meanings of words and phrases. Reread line 401. Use the context of surrounding words to determine the meaning of invalid. What does the word invalid suggest about how Mrs. Stevenson perceives herself? Pause while you think. She sees herself as ill, helpless, and always requiring care from others. It's notable that the word invalid was more common at the time that this play was first performed. It would no longer be an appropriate way to categorize someone in a similar situation today. Characters' gestures and postures on stage reveal what they are thinking and feeling. Scan lines 415 through 439. Identify words that show what Duffy is doing. What do his actions reveal about him? Pause while you think. Duffy yawns slightly, reaches for a paper cup of coffee. He begins to remove the top of the coffee container, puts down the phone to work on the cup. His actions show that he is unconcerned about Mrs. Stevenson's report and has no intention of getting involved. Based on the emergency procedures of our time, how would you expect Duffy's response to Mrs. Stevenson to be different? Pause while you think. Duffy would most likely have to dispatch an officer to investigate, no matter how he may have felt about Mrs. Stevenson's reliability. It is the job of a first responder to attempt to put a distressed person at ease so that he or she can feel safe to share information or to follow instructions. To uphold public safety in these times, all responders have to show a degree of concern. A dramatist, the person who writes a drama, uses dialogue to reveal character. The audience uses what the character says to make inferences or good guesses about what the character doesn't say. Reread lines 487 through 498. What can you infer about Mrs. Stevenson that she herself doesn't seem to realize? Pause while you think. Mrs. Stevenson says that she can't imagine anyone wanting to kill her, yet goes on to name two people who might have reason to, her maid and her husband. In a staged drama, sound effects may be used to show elements of the time and place of the action, or setting. Reread lines 537 through 539. Identify the sound effect and explain its significance. Pause while you think. The train roaring by in the distance is a reminder that the murderers are planning to use the sound of a train to muffle the victim's screams. As the rising action of the plot continues, the main character tries to deal with obstacles that prevent her from resolving the conflict. Reread lines 567 through 581. Describe the new obstacle Mrs. Stevenson encounters and how she handles it. Pause while you think. Now the phone rings, but nobody is on the other end. She handles this problem poorly, just shouting, "Hello!" repeatedly and slamming down the receiver. A dramatist uses dialogue to move the action along. Reread what the man from Western Union says beginning in line 656. What new obstacle is being presented? Pause while you think. Mrs. Stevenson's husband is not coming home tonight, and she now must deal with being alone. Stage directions help readers visualize the action and imagine the emotions that audiences experience. Reread the stage directions in lines 683 through 689. Identify the words that convey emotion. Pause while you think. Panic, frenzied, and beats with her knuckles on the bed show that Mrs. Stevenson is out of control with frustration and terror. The sound of a train roaring by outside is like a scream that adds to the feeling of terror. Mrs. Stevenson is now attempting to handle the obstacle of facing being home alone at night. Attend to the way that dialogue can build suspense. Reread the conversation between Mrs. Stevenson and the woman at Henchley Hospital. How does this dialogue build suspense? Pause while you think. The dialogue creates tension because Mrs. Stevenson's growing panic is contrasted with the businesslike manner of the woman. Time is passing, the murder is about to be committed, and Mrs. Stevenson still can't get anyone to help her. The rising action of the plot is almost at the point of greatest tension, called the climax. Reread Mrs. Stevenson's dialogue beginning on line 821. Tell how an audience would probably be reacting at this point in the play. Pause while you think. People at a live performance of this drama are probably biting their knuckles or shading their eyes because the tension is almost unbearable. They've strongly suspected that Mrs. Stevenson is the intended murder victim, and now that someone is downstairs, they know for sure. The play is approaching the climax. At the climax, audiences know how the conflict will be resolved. Reread lines 850 through 871. Why is this the climax of the play? Pause while you think. Mrs. Stevenson is desperately trying to overcome the final obstacle, her murderer in her house, by calling the police. Her screams and the shadow rushing in the darkness create an emotional peak. Her silence tells the audience that the conflict has been resolved with her murder. Tension eases during falling action, the events following the climax and leading to the last event of the plot called the resolution. Irony can refer to something that the audience knows, but a character does not. Reread lines 895 through 898. What does George say and do at the resolution of the plot? What is ironic about that remark and action? Pause while you think. George says, "Sorry, wrong number," and hangs up. The audience knows that his victim has been trying to use the phone as a lifeline, doing nothing but calling wrong numbers, never finding the connection that would prevent her death.